Show me the money! Hello everyone and welcome to episode number 85 of Movies Are Awesome, the show all about leather crafting. My name is Nathan Pottle and thank you for joining me today. And just before we get started, I want to say, first off, I might not have an episode next week. And that's because we're right in peak season at work here, and I'm going to be working a lot of overtime in the next few weeks. So if I just don't have the mental capacity to sit down and record an episode, I am sorry, but I'm going to be working 50, 60-hour weeks for the next little while here. So unfortunately, not going to have a lot of time for watching movies in general, let alone sitting down and recording about movies. So today might be the last one for a bit, which is unfortunate. Hopefully I find the time to get it done, but we'll see. No promises though, just a fair warning there. Speaking of work though, today's topic was recommended to me by one of my coworkers. His name is Nick, and I was saying, hey, I'm wanting to watch a movie and do a review for it today, and he came up with today's suggestion. So today I'm talking about Atlantis, the Lost Empire, which is one of these Disney movies from that early 2000s era. That era that doesn't really get talked about as much. Movies like Lilo and Stitch, Brother Bear, Treasure Planet, The Emperor's New Groove, Chicken Little, and Home on the Range, if you like those two. But generally, these movies are not as well received and kind of underrated. And so, yeah, I'm gonna talk about Atlantis: The Lost Empire today. It is gonna be spoilers throughout. Not that this movie is super spoilery or plot heavy, but it's still good to warn people beforehand when talking about things like that. So let's get talking about Atlantis. This movie was released in 2001, and it's directed by Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise. If you're not familiar with them as directors, they also directed The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Beauty and the Beast, which Beauty and the Beast is kind of a landmark animation film because it was the first animated movie to be nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, which was kind of a big deal back in 1992 when it first got nominated. Now, we've had a few other animated movies be nominated since then, those being Toy Story 3 and Up. But the fact that these two guys directed Beauty and the Beast and Hunchback, which are both fantastic movies, then they came in and did Atlantis: The Lost Empire, that gives a lot of faith in this project. These are good directors, they know what they're doing, and I'm excited about this movie. As far as the writers go and the story, the writers, the only one really of note is Joss Whedon worked on the story of this one, which I find very interesting. He's worked on a lot of things since then. He's pretty famous and well known. He hasn't done too much lately though. Ever since doing the Avengers, he's kind of tapered off. But let's talk about the story of Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Basically, we follow the main character of Milo, and he is continuing his grandfather's search for the lost continent of Atlantis. Now, we have some clues from the past, from Plato and other people, and he is putting these clues together and trying to fund an expedition. Very quickly, though, he meets a shadowy figure who was friends with his grandfather, who lost a bet, and is going to fully fund his expedition, and so off he goes into the ocean, trying to figure out what happened to Atlantis. And when they get there and they discover that not only is Atlantis in fact real, but people are still alive down there and they are thriving in their culture, but also maybe they're not as well off as he thinks they may be. So there's some mystery there, there's some Indiana Jones type adventuring going on in this movie, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, I quite enjoy this movie. I think it's good. I don't think it's top tier Disney animation. I don't think it's top tier Disney storytelling, but I think it's good upper middle tier. Like, it's not phenomenal like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or Beauty and the Beast or anything like that, but it's not bottom of the barrel like Chicken Little and Meet the Robinsons and Home on the Range, movies like that. But like I said before, it is one of those ones that often gets missed and overlooked, and I think part of that has to be with the animation quality of this movie. Now, I want to talk specifically about the animation style. The way that all of the characters are drawn, it's with very harsh lines and sharp angles. Like when you look at the characters' ears, their ears are not round, they're a bunch of straight lines going around in a circle. It's very jagged. all of the characters' fingernails are triangles. Their hair doesn't move very well. It's like the entire aesthetic of this movie feels a little off just because of the strange animation style that they chose to go with for this movie. And while I feel it kind of works as a whole, because it's so different from other things that we're used to from the studio, we overlook this movie because they're like, oh, it's just that weird looking one. Also, as far as this movie's looks go, there's a lot of CGI blending in with cell animation, and a lot of it doesn't really work. It doesn't look that good. It's a lot like when you watch Hercules, and Hercules is fighting the Hydra, and the Hydra is all CGI, and Hercules is standing there, and it really clashes. There are moments like this where the traditional cell animation and the CGI that they're blending in there, they just don't mesh, they don't mix. It looks really bad, especially when we get to the climax of this movie where Atlantis is in danger and lava is flowing everywhere and there are all of these flying machines. It looks really quite bad. I just rewatched this movie last night and turned to my wife while we were watching it. I said, like, this just it just doesn't look any good. And maybe back in 2001, it did look really good, but it has not aged well. This movie's almost 20 years old, which is crazy to think about. Because if this movie is 20 years old, then that means Lord of the Rings is 20 years old. And if Lord of the Rings is 20 years old, then that means I feel really old myself. That means I'm getting close to 30. And oh my goodness. I digress though. Let's get back to talking about Atlantis, the Lost Empire. This movie, while the animation is not top notch, I do think that the characters that we get are top notch. We get really good character work in this movie. Specifically, the main character of Milo. We get a character named Dr. Sweet, Mole, Audrey, Vinny. All of these characters that we get, they're all very unique. Everyone has they have a thing to them, you know? Like, Vinny is the one, he likes to blow things up, and so he always has dynamite, or instead of a toothpick in his mouth, he always has a match. Or Audrey is the young girl who fixes engines, and so that's her thing. And all these characters, they have a thing, and they stick to that thing, but they're also not one-dimensional. We get a scene in the movie where they're all sitting by the campfires, very classic, and they're talking about their backstories, and I really like that scene a lot, because it does give us a little bit of depth and meaning to these characters. We don't get a scene like that for the captain or for the, I don't know the character's name, but she's like the Black Widow type lady. She doesn't really get a background, and so it doesn't matter as much. But then we have the character of Kita, who is a Disney princess, but she's not a Disney princess. She's not part of the actual Disney royal court, I believe. But she's interesting, and there's stuff going on with Atlantis. There's magic and mystery and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's maybe what I like about this movie the most, is that all of the mystery surrounding it. I really like movies where, okay, we're going on a journey and we have puzzles to figure out. Is this swashbuckling adventure? And that's kind of what this movie is, of putting the pieces together, figuring out what's going on, and coming to the resolution. It reminds me a lot of Indiana Jones, and to a lesser extent, Aquaman had this kind of feel as well when they're putting pieces together. I like that kind of stuff. And so getting it out of an animated movie, I really enjoyed it, because everybody knows I'm a sucker for animation. I will sit down and watch it all the time. I just love animation so much. So this movie's kind of giving me all of the story things that I want. There's also a lot of really good humor in this movie as well, specifically from these characters, because they're all so unique. Their character interactions are often quite humorous, and I found myself laughing out loud a lot throughout rewatching the movie. It's been, it actually hasn't been that long since I watched Atlantis, the Lost Empire. Like a year or two ago at the most was the last time that I watched this movie, and I still think of it fondly. It's a very funny movie. It's enjoyable. There are some things, however, that I don't like about it as much, and why don't I talk about that right now? I already said some of the CGI, it doesn't blend very well, and it looks kind of bad. One of the other things I don't really like about this movie, and it kind of ties into one of the things that I do like, is that with all of the mystery surrounding Atlantis and their magic and their power source and their deity, we don't really get a lot of clarity on that as to exactly what's going on within the city. We know that the heart of Atlantis needs some kind of source, or the heart of Atlantis is the source, and it's a deity that has a consciousness that formed over thousands of years. And we know that Kita's mother sacrificed herself and became one with the heart of Atlantis sometime during Atlantis' destruction, and things like that. So we don't get a whole lot of clarity. We have a little bit of time with the King of Atlantis, who's voiced by Leonard Nimoy. He sits down and he does some explaining, but actually not a lot. And then when Kita, she goes up and they're like, well, we gotta save her before she becomes one with the heart of Atlantis. Like, wouldn't that be a good thing though, if she's up there and she's protecting everybody? Or is this something that I'm missing? Like, isn't becoming one with your deity, wouldn't that be a good thing? But I guess maybe not, because they want to get her back, or maybe it's just because they're selfish and she's a pretty girl and they want to save the pretty girl or something like that. I don't know. That's something that I don't really like about this movie, is we don't really have a clear understanding of what's going on as far as the mythos and lore of Atlantis. As far as that stuff goes, we don't get a lot of it, and I would like just a little bit more. And then my other negative that I have to say about this movie is that the movie gets started very, very quickly. Like it's within 10 minutes of the start time, and they're already like on the ship ready to go. Like in the first 10 to 15 minutes, it doesn't take very long. We don't get a lot of time to meet Milo and really figure him out. We do that later in the movie. We don't get a lot of setup for Atlantis. It's like here's the Cole's notes of what the story is, and let's go. This movie's only an hour and 35 minutes, so they're not wasting any time. And I like when movies have a little bit of a slower start and takes the time to lay the foundation of the story instead of jumping us right into it, giving us the time to... I want the time to meet and know the characters before they go on the journey, so that I can really feel and understand. I can sympathize with them. I can relate with them. Things like that, you know? And we don't get that as much in this movie. I'm going to compare it to The Lord of the Rings, which actually came out in the same year as this. The Fellowship of the Ring came out in 2001. We get a lot of time with Frodo and Sam and just spending time in the Shire before they go out on their journey. So we know who they are. We understand them. We like them. These are good people. And then off they go on their journey. And that's great. That's what I want. Can every movie just be as good as The Lord of the Rings is? If we could have that, what a world we would live in. If I could just sit down and watch a movie and know I was getting the quality of just love and tender care that The Lord of the Rings has, that would just be phenomenal. I would love that so much. That's not what I'm talking about today, though. I'm letting myself get distracted. We're talking about The Lord of the Rings. No, we're talking about Atlantis: The Lost Empire today, not The Lord of the Rings, as much as I would like to. But actually, going back to my notes here, looking at what I have to say, I think I've said it all already. Actually, I have one more thing I want to say negative about this movie, and some of the story beats are very predictable. When the captain of the ship eventually turns on Milo and it's all about the money, you can see that coming from a mile away. From the very first time that you meet him, you 100% get the vibes that, okay, this guy's the real villain. He's going to turn on everybody. He's just here to get rich. And that's eventually what happens. There's no hiding that at all whatsoever. It's not a surprise twist. It's nothing that you don't see coming 100%. So that's one thing that I want to say that is another negative of this movie. Other than that, though, Atlantis is pretty fun to watch. It's enjoyable. I will probably continue to watch it in the future. With these negatives aside, it's still an enjoyable movie. Like I said, it's part of that Disney era that's kind of underrated, because we had that Disney Renaissance starting in the late 80s and working throughout the 90s, where we had like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Hunchback of Notre Dame and Aladdin and all of these movies coming out in the 90s, and they're just mega hits. Then by the time we hit the early 2000s, when we had Lilo and Stitch and Brother Bear, Treasure Planet, Atlantis, Emperor's New Groove, while a lot of those movies are really strong, especially Lilo and Stitch, that movie's fantastic, we got into this area where it's just, oh yeah, Disney's making movies, here it is. And then a little while later. Then we had The Princess and the Frog, which is kind of in between eras, and then starting in 2010 when we had Tangled, and then Frozen and Moana, and now we're in kind of this new decade of movies. But now we're not even in that decade anymore, so maybe we're branching off into a new era. I don't know what's going on with Disney's movies right now. We get Maya and the Last Dragon coming out next year, so we'll see how that one is. I'm looking forward to that movie. I would have liked for it to come out sooner, or is it coming out in March? I think it's coming out in March, and we get the new Pixar movie coming out in December. It's going to be on Disney Plus. Soul is coming out. I'm very excited for that one. There are movies coming, and I can be excited about them. Unfortunately, the list of movies that are coming is very, very small. Once again, though, I digress. That's off topic today. That's going to be it for today. I've got everything that I had to say about The Last Empire. Atlantis: The Last Empire is a good movie. I recommend watching it if you haven't. But if you have seen it, I would like to know what you think about the movie. So why don't you feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at Pottle Nathan, and you can find the show on Instagram at Movies Are Awesome Podcast. Also, if you want to email the show, you can do that at moviesareawesomepod@gmail.com. If you haven't done so already, please feel free to subscribe to the show. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and a whole bunch of other places. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode about a movie that not that many people have seen and not that many people are interested in, but here I am talking about it anyway, and I had a good time watching it, and I had a good time talking about it, and that's all that matters. So thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and as always, if you have nothing else to do, go watch more movies.